So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is when a portion of the heart is hypertrophied, usually the septum. And why does it occur? Well, you inherit it in a autosomal dominant fashion, and then usually on step, they'll give you a scenario where there's a young athlete that has sudden cardiac death, and so usually you have to keep hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in the top of your differential when you see these buzzwords. And then finally, beta blockers are first line. But the main thing I want to go over in this video is what they usually test, which is physiology. So usually what they want to know is what happens when you do a certain bedside maneuver, like standing up or Valsalva, and how does that affect the intensity of the murmur. So this is kind of complicated because it's different from the other murmurs, because usually in a murmur, when the flow increases, the murmur also increases in intensity. But in this case, it's actually the opposite for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And so anything that decreases the amount of blood in the left ventricle will cause the murmur to increase in intensity. And then anything that increases the blood in the left ventricle will cause the murmur to decrease in intensity. And so this is usually opposite for normal murmurs, and that's why it's kind of confusing. But I hope this kind of clears it out. So if you have decreased amount of blood in the left ventricle, right? So in this image, just think about it like a person, right? Like if you have a small person and this is your hypertrophied septum and this is your right ventricle, left ventricle, and you only have a tiny amount of blood, which is represented by this person, then this person can't push out to get out through the left ventricular outflow tract. But if you have a lot of blood, right, and so it's a bigger person, they can actually push through and then push away the septum, so the blood can go out through the left ventricular outflow tract. So just to clarify, how to decrease blood in the left ventricle is by standing up or doing Valsalva, which both decrease preload. And how that works is when you stand up, you can think of the veins as a reservoir of blood. So all the blood will essentially go back into the veins, and then that will decrease the amount of blood going to the right atrium, and therefore decrease the amount of blood going to the left ventricle. And then the opposite is if you want to increase blood in the left ventricle, that would be increasing afterload, and that would be by doing hand grip. So if you clench your hands into a fist, that will increase the resistance, therefore increase afterload, and make it harder for blood to get out, and so therefore increase blood in the left ventricle. So how this affects the intensity of the murmur. So in this case, if you stood up or if you did Valsalva, that would decrease blood in the left ventricle, and then if you decrease the amount of blood in the left ventricle, that would increase in intensity, and if you increase blood in the left ventricle by doing hand grip, that would decrease the intensity. Because when you have an obstruction, like here, that increases the sound because there's an obstruction, but when there's no obstruction, when you have a lot of blood, then that will decrease the intensity. So I hope that helped, and thanks for watching.